The movie begins in 2049. Life on Earth is threatened due to air pollution, and as a result, the vast majority of people living in the Arctic are forced to leave the area. However, Augustine has a terminal illness, and because of this, he decides to stay behind in a lunar observatory to assist astronauts in finding a planet in better conditions than Earth. Consequently, Augustine begins to lead an extremely solitary life, to the point where he plays chess alone and drinks heavily in an attempt to drown his loneliness. At least once a week, he needs a blood transfusion to avoid dying from his illness. Then, he remembers the time when he was young and used to teach astronomy to dozens of students at the university. At that time, Augustine had explained that the moon called K23 would be the ideal place for people to live, because this moon doesn't require a sun to sustain human life. With this, Augustine is warmly applauded by the audience, and at the party after the presentation, an attractive woman named Jeanne approaches him and begins to flirt. Thus, the two sit down to talk, and the woman asks if humans can really live on the moon K23, or if Augustine is only saying this to self-promote and make a lot of money from books and lectures. Unfortunately, we couldn't hear the answer because the present-day Augustine woke up just then. He arrives in the control room and requests to see all the active space missions. To our surprise, most of them have failed, and only one called Ether is still active. Then, he sees a photo of the astronauts participating in this mission and recognizes a woman named Sully among the 5. Therefore, Augustine decides to get in touch. But first, he will have to wait for 11 hours until the spacecraft gets close enough for him to send a message. Even in 2049, people still have problems with signal loss, although we are talking about thousands of kilometers of distance between the spacecraft and Earth. Shifting to Sully, she has a nightmare and believes she is on the moon, K23, abandoned by her fellow crew members who departed with the ship. It's worth noting that Sully is pregnant, and the child's father is Captain Aid. Following this, she goes to the communication room to begin her duties. However, Sully and the other members of the spacecraft become concerned when they realize it has been 3 weeks since they received the last message from Earth, which could mean there are no more humans alive there. Back to Augustine, he's in the observatory's cafeteria when he strangely finds a bowl of food left on one of the tables, so he thinks he must have forgotten this bowl and goes back to work as usual. However, suddenly, the fire alarm starts ringing, and Augustine rushes to see what's happening, finding the kitchen on fire. Fortunately, he manages to extinguish everything with a fire extinguisher, and as he sits on the floor, he is surprised to find a little girl hidden under the counter. Therefore, Augustine tries to contact the authorities to report that a little girl was left behind during the evacuation. However, no one responds to his messages, leaving him frustrated. Afterward, he finds the girl sleeping on a shelf in a tool cabinet and explains that he can't take care of her alone. But the little girl doesn't say a word, almost as if she's deaf or mute. In this way, Augustine feels sorry for the girl and decides to prepare her dinner. Then he snaps his fingers near her ears to test if she's deaf, but she reacts to the sound. So, the little girl draws a flower called Iris to show him that this is her name. Later, he tries to contact the Ether spacecraft but fails. Then, Iris is fascinated by a picture of the ship, and Augustine explains to her that the future of humanity depends on the success of this mission. A few hours later, the two are getting ready to sleep, and Iris tries to sleep in Augustine's room, but he doesn't allow it, and puts the little girl in the room just across the hall. However, Iris waits for Augustine to lie down and returns to sleep in his room, and all he needed to do was lock the door with the key to prevent the little troublemaker from entering his room in the middle of the night. On the following day, Augustine examines the observatory's antenna and realizes it's not powerful enough to send a message to the astronauts on the Ether spacecraft. Speaking of them, the pilot named Mitchell is having breakfast in a holographic environment that simulates his old home on Earth, allowing him to cope with missing his wife and children. I think NASA should implement a system like this in future missions, as it should greatly help maintain the astronauts' mental well-being. Next, Captain Aid explains that they have been in space for 2.5 years and are returning from the moon K23 to inform the rest of humanity that this location is entirely safe for living. Back on Earth, it's midnight, and Augustine is undergoing another blood transfusion. Iris sits beside him to gaze at the sky, and Augustine shows her the North Star, explaining that it's the most important one because it allows you to locate yourself geographically. Then we move on to another flashback from Augustine's past and discover that he is dating Jean. However, Jean complains that he works all day and is so focused on finding life on other planets that he has forgotten to live his own life. Thus, the flashback ends with Jean crying and revealing that she is not pregnant and that it was just a false alarm. Back in the present, Augustine goes out to check the antenna once again and finds several dead birds in the snow. With this, he realizes that air pollution has arrived sooner than he had anticipated. Afterward, Augustine begins to examine the map of the region and shows the little girl that the weather station at Lake Hazen has an antenna strong enough for them to contact the astronauts. Moreover, this station is surrounded by mountains, so the climate change has not affected it yet. Therefore, Augustine packs the transfusion equipment into a briefcase and also backs up some data onto an external hard drive. Then, he and Iris put on masks to breathe outside and hop on a snowmobile to begin their journey to the station. Back with the astronauts, young Maya is using holograms to cope with missing her sister and best friend, while Sully and her husband are playing cards to pass the time. Suddenly, the emergency alarm sounds, alerting everyone that the spacecraft has deviated from its planned course and is no longer returning to Earth. Consequently, they start calculating new routes, but the only problem is that they will have to pass through several unknown zones, risking the spacecraft colliding with asteroids, much like what happened to the Titanic. But instead of an iceberg, it's asteroids. Shifting to Augustine, night falls, and he and the little girl need to camp in the middle of nowhere in a tiny tent. The next day, they no longer need to use masks because the air in this region is safe. Augustine approaches a crashed plane and fires shots into the air to scare away some wolves that are nearby. Then, he begins to explore the aircraft's interior, and surprisingly, a survivor grabs his leg, nearly giving him a heart attack. The survivor whispers to Augustine to end his suffering, as he is very weak and has no strength left to speak. Meanwhile, Iris sees the body of one of the pilots and becomes frightened. Consequently, the little girl enters the plane, but Augustine makes her leave because he is going to end the survivor's suffering. Therefore, he takes his rifle and does the job while Iris waits for him outside. Afterward, Augustine has a sad expression on his face for what has just occurred. And have you ever wondered what you would have done in Augustine's place? Would you try to save the survivor at all costs? Or would you respect his request and end his suffering with the weapon? Continuing with the story, we see another scene from the guy's past where he is watching Jean from a distance as she puts their daughter in the car. Surprisingly, Augustine has never uttered a word to the little girl, and because of this, Jean approaches to ask if he wants to meet her. However, he declines because he is focused on his mission to find life on another planet. Back in the present, Maya performs an ultrasound on Sully using a machine designed to help find signs of life on other planets. They both rejoice upon hearing the child's heartbeat, and Maya reveals that it's a girl. Subsequently, Sully shares the news with her husband, and they begin to think about what name they will give to the little girl. But a quick question arises. If this girl is born outside of Earth, will she automatically become an extraterrestrial? Back to Augustine, Iris spots a bunker from a distance and points it out to him. Consequently, they enter the shelter, and Augustine says they will spend the night there since the bunker is much better than that tiny tent. A few minutes later, Iris starts drawing her mother's face, and Augustine mentions that he once knew a woman with blue hair, just like the drawing. Then, Iris speaks for the first time since meeting Augustine and asks if he loved that woman. However, once again, we are left without knowing the answer, and the scene cuts to a few minutes later, with the bunker being flooded from the inside because it sank into the ice. Augustine grabs the little girl and tries to escape through the door, but he can't because there's a block of ice blocking the way. Fortunately, he manages to break the glass of the door with his rifle and puts the little girl outside the bunker. However, the transfusion equipment is left behind, and Augustine goes back to retrieve it while the bunker sinks further into the ice. Nevertheless, Augustine manages to get out in time and hops onto the snowmobile to try to escape from that place. However, the bike sinks completely in the water along with the transfusion equipment, and Augustine even tries to retrieve the device but fails. Later, as dawn breaks, they are forced to continue the rest of the journey on foot. They have no more food because the supplies were left in the bunker. So Augustine tries to reassure Iris by telling her that there will be pizza and other delicious foods waiting for them at the Lake Hazen weather station. So, they resume their walk, and a fierce snowstorm begins, greatly obscuring their vision. But as if things couldn't get any worse, a pack of wolves appears and surrounds them. Augustine takes his rifle and shoots at the wolves. However, he becomes distracted and loses sight of the girl. Consequently, he desperately screams for Iris to follow the sound of his voice. Unfortunately, it doesn't work, and Augustine loses hope. A few minutes later, the storm subsides, and Augustine initially thinks his ex-wife is standing in front of him. However, he quickly realizes it's Iris who is there. Therefore, Augustine embraces the little girl, and eventually, they manage to reach the weather station. With this, Augustine hurries and starts the process to contact the astronauts. Moving on to them, Mitchell suggests to Aid that the child's name should be Jacinta, because that was his mother's name. But clearly, Aid despises the idea. Sully is sitting idle and is surprised to receive a message from Augustine. So they start a conversation, and Sully asks why NASA hasn't been in contact with them. Augustine then attempts to explain that conditions on Earth have deteriorated significantly, but the transmission becomes unstable at that very moment, and the signal is cut off. To make matters worse, the spacecraft's alarm begins to sound because they are passing through an unknown zone filled with asteroids. As a result, the spaceship is hit multiple times and sustains significant damage. After all this chaos, the astronauts calm down and assess the damage. They realize that both the communication antennas and the radar have been destroyed. Mitchell explains that they can be fixed, but someone has to be willing to go outside to make the repairs. Maya, Sully, and Aid volunteer for the mission, but the problem is that Maya has never been outside the spacecraft before, so she becomes quite nervous and vomits into a bag. Then, the three of them exit the ship and are amazed by the beauty of space. They use hooks with ropes to prevent themselves from floating aimlessly in space in case of an accident. If you were in the place of these astronauts, do you think you would be enchanted by the beauty of space? Or would you be afraid to be in such an empty and inhospitable place? Fortunately, things are going very well, and the three of them start the repairs without major issues. Sanchez even plays music on the astronauts' communicators to keep them entertained while they are outside. They manage to fix the radar, which soon warns them that several asteroids are approaching the spacecraft. However, it's too late, and many of them are heading toward the three astronauts. Consequently, they are forced to take cover on the opposite side of the spacecraft to survive. After a few minutes, the asteroids stop coming toward the astronauts, and the three appear to be unharmed. However, surprisingly, Maya sees some drops of blood floating inside her helmet and realizes she is injured. Aid takes Maya back into the spacecraft, and Sanchez retrieves a medical kit to try to help her. However, Sully removes Maya's helmet, and a significant amount of blood starts floating, indicating that the injury is much worse than they thought. As a result, the young woman cries and says that she's going to die, but the other astronauts try to reassure her while making efforts to stop the bleeding. However, unfortunately, Maya gradually stops breathing and dies due to the injuries caused by the collision between the spacecraft and the asteroids. In this way, Maya's body is placed on a stretcher, and the astronauts mourn and lament the young woman's death. Sanchez even activates a hologram featuring Maya to help ease their longing for her. Afterward, Mitchell manages to access an image from a satellite near Earth and calls everyone to see the state of the planet. However, the image is far from encouraging, and they all become shaken when they realize that Earth's atmosphere has deteriorated significantly since they departed. Back on Earth, Augustine is weak and ill because he lost the machine that was performing his blood transfusion treatment. Then, Sully contacts him to inquire if there is a safe place on Earth where they can land. Augustine replies that there isn't, and explains that the only habitable regions are underground. Therefore, he shares information from that hard drive with the astronauts and devises a plan involving the spacecraft gaining momentum from Earth's gravity to conserve fuel and return to the moon K-23, thus abandoning all the people still alive on Earth. As a result, most of the astronauts agree to this plan, but Mitchell, who is the pilot, refuses to leave his family behind on Earth. So, Sanchez shows a message that the man's wife sent 10 days ago, in which she explains that their children are sick due to the polluted air. Consequently, Mitchell talks to Aid and asks for permission to return to Earth using one of the re-entry modules, while the other astronauts return to the moon, K-23. Aid understands the man's concerns and grants him permission to do so. Later, Mitchell is packing his belongings to leave, and Sanchez arrives and says that he will go with him. The problem is that without the two of them, the spacecraft will be without pilots, so Mitchell questions why the man made this decision. Thus, Sanchez explains that his daughter died when she was only 4 years old, and today, she would be the same age as Maya. In this way, Sanchez reveals that he wants to take Maya's body back to Earth to honor her memory. After a few days, the spacecraft begins to approach Earth, and Sanchez, D. Mitchell don their spacesuits and say their farewells to the rest of the crew. Consequently, the two board the re-entry module and return to Earth. Afterward, Sully contacts Augustine to inform him that they are returning to Moon K-23 and that she has always admired his work because Augustine and her mother used to work together. As a result, we discover that Sully is the daughter he had with Jean, and her first name is Iris, with Sully being just the last name. Furthermore, the young girl who had been accompanying Augustine during this journey was only an illusion of the younger version of Iris, as Augustine felt guilty for never having gotten close to his daughter. However, despite this, Augustine holds back tears and decides not to reveal that he is Sully's father. Consequently, the spacecraft enters the blackout zone, and communication between them is cut off. In the end, only Aid and Sully remain inside the spacecraft, and with the baby about to be born, they prepare to continue the human race on Moon K-23, bringing the movie to an end. And remember, when all seems lost, our quest for survival becomes the epic story of resilience. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more movie recaps. See you next time.